AITA for refusing to take care of my parents after they ignored my wedding? I always thought my wedding day would be the most beautiful and joyful event of my life. And in many ways, it was. The sun shone down on us. My partner of 5 years by my side. Surrounded by our closest friends and the family that mattered. We had chosen an intimate ceremony. One that truly reflected who we were as a couple, simple, heartfelt, and meaningful. Every detail, from the flowers to the music, felt right. It should have been perfect. But there was one glaring absence that cast a shadow over the entire day: my parents. They weren't there. They didn't show up for the most important day of my life. And no matter how hard I tried to focus on the love and happiness around me, their absence sat like a weight in my chest. A reminder of everything that had gone wrong between us. I had known for weeks that they wouldn't come. I had even tried to prepare myself for it. But nothing could have truly braced me for how it felt to stand at the altar, looking out at the faces of my loved ones, and not see theirs. My parents had given me every excuse under the sun. They couldn't afford the travel expenses. It was too far. They didn't want to leave their home for an extended period. But deep down, I knew the real reason. They didn't approve of my choices. They didn't approve of my life. They didn't approve of my partner. Growing up, it always felt like I was the outsider in my own family. I wasn't the golden child. That role belonged to my older brother. He was the one who could do no wrong, who always got the praise and attention, while I was left on the sidelines, overlooked and undervalued. It wasn't that my parents were overtly cruel or abusive. They weren't, but there was an unmistakable distance between us. I never felt like I truly belonged, no matter how hard I tried to fit into their expectations. From a young age, I learned that love, at least in my family, was conditional. It depended on meeting their standards, on living up to the image they had of the perfect son. And I never seemed to measure up. Whether it was school, sports, or life decisions, I was always a disappointment. My brother, on the other hand, was celebrated for everything he did. Even when he stumbled, my accomplishments were ignored, brushed aside, or minimized. When I left home for college, that emotional distance became physical too. I left to find my own way, to escape the constant comparisons and the feeling of never being enough. As I grew older, I tried to carve out a life for myself, independent of their expectations. I found success in my career, made friends who felt more like family than my own blood, and, eventually, I found my partner, the person I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. They supported me in ways my parents never had. They believed in me, lifted me up, and made me feel loved unconditionally. Something I had always craved but never truly experienced growing up. So, when it came time to plan the wedding, I knew I had to invite my parents. As strained as our relationship was, I held on to a shred of hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be a moment to bridge the gap between us. I wanted to believe that my parents could set aside their disapproval, that they could show up for me in a way they never had before. I reached out to them, hoping that an invitation to the wedding could be the start of something new. A fresh beginning. I wanted them to meet my partner, to see the life I had built for myself, to understand that I was happy, even if my choices didn't align with what they had imagined for me. But they didn't see it that way. When they declined the invitation, I wasn't surprised, but I was hurt. Deep down, I knew their excuses about travel and finances weren't the real reason. They had attended events for my brother that were much farther away, and the costs hadn't seemed to be an issue then. No, this was about something deeper, something they couldn't say out loud. It was their way of showing that they didn't approve of my partner, my marriage, or the life I had built. They were still holding on to their own image of who I should be. And in their eyes, I had fallen short. Their refusal felt like a final rejection. I had always been the one reaching out, always trying to mend the cracks in our relationship. But now I realized that no matter how much I tried, they weren't willing to meet me halfway. Standing there on my wedding day, surrounded by people who loved and supported me, their absence felt like the closing of a chapter that had been filled with years of trying and failing to earn their approval. In the weeks following the wedding, I tried to focus on the positives, on the love I had felt from those who had attended. My wife was a rock through it all, reminding me that we had created something beautiful together, something that didn't need my parents' validation to be real. But the wound was still fresh, and I couldn't shake the sense of finality that came with their absence. Then, not long after the wedding, I got the call. My parents were struggling. My dad had lost his job, and they were both nearing retirement with not enough savings to cover their bills. My brother, who had always been their go-to for help, was dealing with his own financial issues and couldn't support them anymore. They needed me. After everything, they wanted me to step in, the son they had always overlooked, the one they had chosen not to support on the most important day of his life. Now they needed my help. It felt like a cruel twist of fate, like the universe was testing me to see just how far I was willing to go for people who had never really been there for me. At first, I didn't know how to respond. I felt torn between the ingrained sense of obligation that comes with being someone's child and the overwhelming hurt that came from years of emotional neglect. Part of me wanted to help them, it was what I had been taught to do. After all, you take care of your family, no matter what. But another part of me, a louder, angrier part, couldn't forget the pain of their absence. How could they expect me to step up now when they had failed to show up for me time and time again? I talked it over with my wife, who was supportive of whatever decision I made. She understood the complexity of my feelings, the conflict between guilt and anger, and she assured me that it was okay to set boundaries, even with family, but it didn't make the decision any easier. Other family members began to chime in too, pressuring me to help my parents. They argued that regardless of how they had treated me, they were still my parents, and I had a duty to support them in their time of need. But did I? After everything they had put me through, after years of feeling like I wasn't enough, did I still owe them anything? It was a question I couldn't answer right away. The guilt gnawed at me, but so did the resentment. The thought of taking on their burdens after they had ignored mine for so long felt like a betrayal to myself. I had worked so hard to build a life that was free from their expectations. And now, they were asking me to step back into the role of the dutiful son, to take care of them in ways they had never taken care of me. I wanted to help them, but I also wanted to protect myself. And in the end, I wasn't sure if those two things could coexist. That's when I realized that this wasn't just about money or support. It was about boundaries, about finally standing up for myself after years of feeling like I didn't have the right to. I had spent my whole life trying to win their approval, to be the son they wanted me to be. But in doing so, I had lost sight of my own needs, my own happiness. Now, for the first time, I had to ask myself, what do I want? What do I need to feel whole? And am I willing to sacrifice that just to make peace with people who have never truly been there for me? The answer wasn't easy, but I knew that whatever decision I made, it had to come from a place of self-respect. I had spent too long giving without receiving, and it was time for me to start protecting my own heart. Because in the end, I had learned one thing from my wedding: the people who truly matter are the ones who show up for you, no matter what. And sometimes, that means letting go of the ones who don't. Looking back, I can see it all so clearly now, the way my parents favored my older brother, the golden child, and how I was always left in his shadow. It wasn't something that happened all at once, like a single traumatic event that I could point to and say, this is when everything changed. No, it was more like a slow accumulation, a series of small, everyday moments that, when pieced together, told a story of neglect and indifference. My brother, Matthew, was the pride and joy of the family from the very beginning. He was the firstborn, the one who excelled at everything without trying, the one who always seemed to have the world laid out in front of him. My parents adored him, showered him with praise, and made sure he had everything he needed to succeed. And to be fair, Matthew was a good brother. He wasn't the problem. The problem was how our parents placed him on a pedestal, and how I was constantly expected to measure up to a standard I could never reach. As a child, I didn't fully understand what was happening. I just knew that no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't seem to get their attention the way Matthew could. I remember school report cards, where I'd bring home solid grades, mostly A's and B's, and my parents would offer a half-hearted, "good job," before shifting the conversation to Matthew's latest achievement. He was a straight-A student, a star athlete, and the apple of their eye. Nothing I did ever seemed to matter as much as what he did. And the more I tried to win their approval, the more invisible I felt. I still remember one specific birthday when I turned 10. I had been begging my parents for months for a particular toy, a remote-controlled car that all the kids at school were talking about. I had built up so much excitement for that day, convinced that if I got that car, it would be a sign that my parents had really heard me, that they cared about what I wanted. But when I opened my gift, it wasn't the car. It was a book, some educational thing that I had no interest in, and I could feel my heart sink. I forced a smile, said thank you, and tried to convince myself that it didn't matter. But inside, it felt like just another reminder that I wasn't really being seen. Matthew, of course, got everything he asked for that year, as he always did, and I remember watching him open his presents with ease, basking in the attention and praise from our parents. It wasn't his fault, but it was hard not to feel the sting of comparison. That birthday stuck with me for years, not because of the missed toy, but because it was one of the first times I really understood that I was never going to be the son they wanted me to be. It wasn't just the material things, either. It was the way my parents showed up for him, physically and emotionally, in ways they never did for me. Matthew had a string of soccer games, recitals, and awards ceremonies that my parents always attended without fail. They were there on the sidelines, cheering him on, beaming with pride as he excelled in everything he touched. But when it came to my interests, their involvement was sparse, if it existed at all. In middle school, I joined the debate team. It was something I was passionate about, something I was actually good at. I remember my first big tournament, an event I had worked so hard to prepare for. I had told my parents about it weeks in advance, hoping they would come, hoping that maybe this would be the thing that finally made them proud of me. But they didn't show up. My mom said she had too much work, and my dad had something else that was apparently more important. I stood on that stage, giving the best speech I could, while other kids had their parents in the audience. And I felt alone. It was like everything I did existed in a vacuum, unseen, unheard, unimportant. That pattern continued into high school. Matthew was a star football player, and my parents never missed a game. I was involved in different things, clubs, art, academics, but none of it seemed to matter to them. I remember getting a scholarship for a summer art program, something I was really excited about. I brought home the acceptance letter, hoping for at least a little celebration. But my mom's only response was, "Oh, that's nice." And then she immediately pivoted to asking how Matthew's football season was going. I internalized all of this, though I didn't realize it at the time. When you're a kid, you don't have the language to express feelings of neglect or favoritism. You just know that you feel different, that you feel less than, and that no matter what you do, it's never enough. I spent so many years trying to be the son they wanted. But it became clear over time that I was never going to fill that role. That was Matthew's spot, and I was just there, someone to compare him to. Someone who would never quite live up to the standard they set for him. When it came time for me to leave for college, the emotional distance between us only grew. I chose a school far from home, partly because I wanted to pursue my own path, and partly because I needed the space. I needed to escape from the constant comparisons and the feeling that I was always falling short. College was my chance to start fresh, to find out who I was without the weight of their expectations hanging over me. But even in college, the strain with my parents didn't ease. I called home less and less. And when I did, our conversations were always surface level. My mom would ask how school was going. I'd give a generic answer. And then she'd steer the conversation back to Matthew, who by then was excelling in his career and getting ready to start a family of his own. The calls became obligatory. More of a formality than a real connection. It was clear that my parents were more invested in Matthew's life than in mine. And I had learned to accept it, even if it still hurt. There were a few moments when I tried to bridge the gap, to reach out and see if there was any way to repair the relationship. I remember once, after graduating college, I invited my parents to visit the city I had moved to. I thought maybe if they saw the life I was building for myself, they'd understand that I was doing okay. That I was finding my own way, even if it wasn't the path they had envisioned for me. But they never made the trip. They always had an excuse: work, money, time. And again, I was left with the feeling that I wasn't important enough for them to make the effort. That's when I stopped trying. I stopped expecting them to show up for me. I stopped hoping that things would change. And in a way, that helped. I began to focus more on the relationships that mattered, the ones I had built with friends, with mentors, and eventually with my partner. Those were the people who saw me, who cared about me, who made me feel valued. I learned to fill the gaps that my parents had left behind. And for a while, it worked. But then the wedding came, and all the old wounds resurfaced. I had invited my parents, hoping against hope that maybe they'd finally come through. that they'd recognize how important this day was to me. But when they declined the invitation, it felt like I was 10 years old again, opening that birthday gift that wasn't what I'd asked for, trying to smile and pretend it didn't hurt. Their refusal wasn't just about missing a single event, it was about a lifetime of missed moments. It was about all the times I had tried to win their approval and failed. All the times I had reached out and been met with indifference. The wedding was supposed to be a celebration of love, of the family I was creating for myself. But their absence was a reminder that the family I had come from had never truly been there for me. After the wedding, when they called asking for help, it felt like a cruel joke. For years, I had been the one reaching out, trying to mend the relationship. And now, when they needed something from me, they expected me to be there for them. The son they had overlooked, the one they had pushed aside, was now the one they were turning to for support. And I didn't know how to feel about it. Part of me wanted to help them, to prove that I was the better person, that I could rise above the hurt they had caused me. But another part of me, the part that had been neglected for so long, wanted to shut them out. I had spent so many years trying to heal from the wounds they had inflicted. And now they were asking me to open myself up to them again. To take care of them when they had never taken care of me. It felt like an impossible choice, between obligation and self-preservation. Between guilt and anger. And no matter what decision I made, I knew that it would come with consequences. But one thing was clear. I couldn't ignore the past anymore. I couldn't pretend that their absence hadn't shaped me, hadn't left scars that I was still trying to heal. This wasn't just about money or support, it was about finally acknowledging the ways they had hurt me. And deciding whether or not I was willing to let them back into my life. And for the first time, I was beginning to wonder if I owed them anything at all. In the weeks leading up to my wedding, I was filled with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Marrying my partner was one of the best decisions of my life. And the planning process had been mostly enjoyable. Despite the usual stress that comes with such a big event, we had crafted a ceremony that felt true to us, small, intimate, and filled with personal touches that reflected our relationship. It was everything I had ever wanted. But as the day approached, there was a constant nagging thought in the back of my mind. My parents. I had invited them, of course, despite the emotional distance between us. Despite the years of strained relationships and unresolved tensions, I had still sent them an invitation. Deep down, I think I hoped that this could be the moment where everything changed. Maybe they'd realize how important this was to me. Maybe they'd finally see me for who I was and not the son they always wished I would be. It was naive, I know, but I wanted to believe in the possibility of reconciliation. I wanted to believe that family, no matter how broken, could still find a way to show up when it mattered most. But when the response came, I wasn't surprised. Hurt, yes, but not surprised. They weren't coming. They had their excuses lined up. As they always did, the travel was too expensive. They said they didn't want to leave home for an extended period, especially with my dad recently out of work. They made it sound like they had thought about it. Like they had really weighed the decision before turning it down. But I knew better. It wasn't about the money. And it wasn't about the inconvenience. It was about them refusing to support the life I had chosen, the partner I had chosen. I remember sitting with my partner after we received the news. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that it didn't matter, that I had always known they wouldn't come. But as the days passed, the sting of their absence became more pronounced. I couldn't shake the feeling that their refusal wasn't just about the wedding. It was a rejection of everything I had built for myself. My career, my independence, my choice of partner. All the things that made me happy seemed to be things they disapproved of. And this was their way of letting me know. It wasn't the first time they had expressed disapproval of my life. Over the years, they had made it clear in small, passive-aggressive ways. They rarely asked about my partner. And when they did, their questions felt more like probes for weaknesses rather than genuine interest. They would casually mention how Matthew's wife was such a good fit for the family, as if to imply that my partner wasn't. And even though they never said it outright, I knew that they didn't approve of our relationship. The wedding invitation had been my final attempt at extending an olive branch. It was my way of saying, here's your chance to be part of my life. Take it. But they hadn't. Instead, they had chosen to stay away. To let their silence speak louder than words ever could. And that silence weighed heavily on me in the days leading up to the ceremony. The day of the wedding arrived. And I told myself I wouldn't think about them. This was my day. And I was surrounded by people who loved and supported me. My partner's family, who had welcomed me with open arms from the very beginning, were all there, beaming with pride and joy. My closest friends, people who had become like family to me, stood by my side, ready to celebrate this new chapter in my life. It was everything I had ever wanted. But as I stood at the altar, waiting for my partner to walk down the aisle, I couldn't help but scan the room for faces that weren't there. I tried to push the thought away, but it lingered. The empty space where my parents should have been felt like a hole in the fabric of the day. It was a reminder that no matter how much I had built for myself, there would always be a part of me that longed for their approval, their presence. I smiled through the ceremony, focused on my partner and the love we were committing to each other. I laughed with our friends, posed for pictures, and danced at the reception. But beneath it all, there was a sadness that I couldn't shake. I had never truly realized how much I wanted my parents to be part of this moment until they weren't. As the night went on, I found myself stepping outside for some air. The celebration was still in full swing, music and laughter filling the air. But I needed a moment alone. I stood under the night sky, the cool breeze a welcome relief from the heat of the dance floor, and let myself feel the weight of their absence. I wasn't angry, at least. Not in that moment. I was just sad. Sad that they couldn't be there. Sad that they had chosen not to be. Sad that I had spent so much of my life trying to earn their love and approval, only to be met with indifference. I don't know how long I stood out there, lost in my thoughts. Eventually, my partner came to find me, pulling me back into the warmth of the celebration. And for the rest of the night, I pushed the sadness aside and let myself enjoy the joy of the moment. After all, this was my wedding day. It was supposed to be a celebration of love, of new beginnings. And it was, despite everything. But in the days that followed, the hurt resurfaced. The morning after the wedding, as we packed up the venue and prepared to leave for our honeymoon, I kept thinking about the empty seats where my parents should have been. I replayed their excuses in my mind, turning them over like a puzzle I couldn't quite solve. Why hadn't they come? Was it really just about money? Or was it something more? Was it about control? About them trying to send a message that they still didn't approve of my life? I talked it over with my partner during the honeymoon, trying to process the emotions that had been simmering beneath the surface. They were understanding, as always, offering me a space to vent without judgment. But even as I voiced my frustrations, I couldn't help but feel guilty. Maybe I'm overreacting, I thought. Maybe I'm expecting too much from them. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. I had spent years lowering my expectations, making excuses for their behavior, telling myself that they loved me in their own way. But their absence at my wedding felt like the final straw, the moment when I could no longer pretend that things would ever change. They had made their choice, and now I had to make mine. When we returned from our honeymoon, the weight of their absence still lingered. I tried to move forward, focusing on the new life I was building with my partner. But then, out of the blue, I received a call from my parents. It had been weeks since the wedding, and I hadn't heard a word from them, not even a card or a message congratulating us. I had assumed they were content to continue ignoring me, as they always had, but now, they were reaching out, and I could tell from the tone of my mom's voice that this wasn't a casual call. They needed my help. My dad had lost his job, and their financial situation was worse than I had realized. They were both nearing retirement age but hadn't saved enough to support themselves. My brother, who had always been their go-to for help, was dealing with his own financial struggles and couldn't step in this time. So now, they were turning to me, the son they had ignored, the one they hadn't bothered to support on the most important day of his life. I was stunned. After everything, they wanted me to help them. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, I had been the one reaching out, trying to mend our relationship, trying to bridge the emotional distance between us. And now, when they were in need, they expected me to step in and take care of them. Part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. After all the rejection, after all the years of feeling like I wasn't enough, they were finally asking for something from me. But another part of me, deeper, quieter, felt the familiar tug of guilt. They were still my parents. And despite everything, I had been raised to believe that family helps family. No matter what, I didn't know how to respond. I felt torn between the obligation I had been conditioned to feel and the anger that had been building inside me for years. How could they expect me to step up now? After all the times they had let me down? How could they ask for my help when they hadn't even bothered to show up for my wedding? I told them I needed time to think about it, that I would call them back once I had made a decision. But the truth was, I didn't know what decision to make. The hurt was too raw, too fresh, and yet, the guilt gnawed at me, pulling me in two different directions. For days, I wrestled with the decision, talking it over with my partner, trying to make sense of my conflicting emotions. My partner was supportive, as always, telling me that I had every right to set boundaries with my parents. But I could see the worry in their eyes, the fear that this conflict with my family would continue to weigh on me, dragging me down just as we were starting our new life together. I felt torn between two worlds, between the family I had created for myself and the family I had come from. And I knew that no matter what choice I made, there would be consequences. The wedding had broken something between us, something that I wasn't sure could be fixed. But now, I had to decide whether I was willing to let it go entirely, or if I was going to keep trying to hold on to a relationship that had never really been there in the first place. And in the end, I knew that the answer wasn't going to come from guilt or obligation. It had to come from a place of self-respect, of finally standing up for myself after years of being overlooked. Because the truth was, I had spent my whole life trying to earn their love, but maybe it was time to stop trying. Maybe it was time to let go. When my parents reached out asking for help, it felt like the universe was playing some cruel joke on me. Here they were, the same people who had refused to show up for my wedding, now calling me out of the blue, expecting me to drop everything and come to their aid. It was as if all the years of neglect and indifference had never happened. As if their absence at the most important moment of my life didn't matter. Now, suddenly, they needed me. My dad had lost his job. My mom explained over the phone, her voice strained with worry. He'd been laid off almost a year ago, and they'd been struggling to make ends meet ever since. They were both nearing retirement age, and their savings, which were already sparse, had dwindled faster than they'd anticipated. On top of that, my brother, Matthew, who had always been their safety net, was having his own financial troubles and couldn't help them this time. So now, they were turning to me. The son they had overlooked, the one who had never been enough, was now their last resort. As my mom laid out their situation, I felt a mix of emotions rising within me. Anger, hurt, confusion, but most of all, guilt. I had been conditioned my whole life to believe that family takes care of family, no matter what. It was a lesson drilled into me from a young age, even as I watched my parents shower Matthew with attention while I stood on the sidelines. Invisible. It didn't matter how they treated me. I was still their son. And sons were supposed to help their parents in times of need. Right? That's what I had been taught. But now, faced with the reality of their request, I wasn't sure if I could follow through. How could I? How could I help them when they had never helped me? How could I put my own life on hold to support people who had consistently made me feel like I didn't matter? After all, they hadn't supported me when I needed them most. They hadn't been there for the milestones in my life. They hadn't come to my wedding. They had chosen, time and time again, to stay distant, to let me fend for myself, to focus their attention on Matthew. And now, when they had nowhere else to turn, they expected me to step in. The anger bubbled up inside me, hot and sharp. How dare they ask me for this? How dare they come to me now? After everything? I had spent years trying to get their approval, trying to build a relationship with them. And every time, they had brushed me aside. And now, when they were in need, they wanted me to forget all of that. They wanted me to swoop in and save the day, like the dutiful son they had never treated me as. But alongside the anger, there was guilt, the kind of guilt that sinks deep into your bones, that lingers long after the anger fades. I had been raised to believe that family loyalty was paramount, that you didn't turn your back on the people who raised you, no matter how flawed they were. And even though my relationship with my parents was strained, no, broken, there was still that voice in the back of my mind, whispering that I had an obligation to them, that no matter what, they were still my parents. I couldn't shake that voice. It gnawed at me in the days following their call. As I tried to sort through my conflicting emotions, I kept replaying their request in my head, imagining different outcomes, different ways I could respond. I thought about what it would mean to say no, to turn them away. Would that make me a bad person? Would it make me just as selfish as they had been all these years? Or would it be an act of self-preservation? A way of finally setting boundaries and protecting myself from further hurt? It was a question I couldn't answer on my own. So I turned to my partner. They had been with me through all of this. Through the wedding, the disappointment, the aftermath. They knew how much my relationship with my parents weighed on me. How much their absence at the wedding had hurt. When I told them about my parents' request, they listened patiently, nodding as I laid out the situation. They didn't interrupt, didn't offer advice right away, they just let me talk. Let me vent the frustration and confusion that had been building inside me. When I finally finished, they spoke softly, their words careful but supportive. "You don't owe them anything," they said. "You've done more than enough to try and fix that relationship. But it's okay to set boundaries. It's okay to take care of yourself." Their words were a balm to my soul, a validation of the conflict I had been feeling. But even with their support, the decision didn't feel any easier. I was still torn between the guilt of saying no and the anger of feeling like I had to say yes. I wanted to believe that I was allowed to set boundaries, that I was allowed to prioritize my own emotional well-being, but years of conditioning had taught me otherwise. Then the calls from extended family members started. Word had gotten around that my parents were struggling, and that I was hesitant to help. I started receiving messages from aunts, uncles, and cousins, all with the same message: they're still your parents. You can't just abandon them. Some were more subtle, framing their arguments as gentle reminders of family duty, while others were more blunt, accusing me of being selfish and ungrateful. The pressure weighed heavily on me. Every call, every message, felt like another layer of guilt being piled onto my shoulders. It didn't matter that my parents had ignored my wedding, that they had never truly supported me, they were still my parents. And in the eyes of my family, that meant I had an obligation to them. I started to doubt myself. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was being selfish. Maybe I was letting my hurt and anger cloud my judgment. After all, my parents were in a tough spot. They were getting older, and they didn't have the resources to support themselves. Was I really going to let them struggle, knowing that I could help? Was I going to turn my back on them in their time of need? Just because of the past? But then I thought about everything I had been through with them. I thought about the years of feeling invisible, the years of trying to earn their love and approval, only to be met with indifference. I thought about how they hadn't shown up for my wedding, how they had made it clear that my happiness, my life, wasn't important to them, and I realized that this wasn't just about money or support. This was about years of emotional neglect, about a relationship that had always been one-sided. Why should I be expected to sacrifice my own happiness and well-being for people who had never made me a priority? Why should I feel obligated to help them when they had never truly helped me? I had spent my entire life trying to win their love, trying to bridge the gap between us. And now, in the one moment when I had the power to say no, they wanted to guilt me into giving more of myself. I knew, deep down, that saying no would come with consequences. My extended family would be disappointed. My parents would be furious. But I also knew that saying yes would mean reopening old wounds. Sacrificing my own mental health for the sake of people who had never truly been there for me. And for the first time, I started to see that I had a right to set boundaries. I had a right to protect myself. I had spent too long giving to a relationship that had only taken from me. And now, I had the chance to take back some control. The decision wasn't easy. It wasn't something I came to lightly. But in the end, I realized that I had to put myself first. I had to stop feeling guilty for wanting to protect my own heart. I had to stop letting the expectations of others dictate how I lived my life. So, I made my choice. I called my parents and told them that I couldn't help them. I explained that while I sympathized with their situation, I didn't feel obligated to step in, given the way they had treated me over the years. I kept my voice calm, measured, but firm. I knew this was the right decision for me, even if it hurt to say the words out loud. My parents didn't take it well. My mom accused me of being selfish, of turning my back on the family that had raised me. She said things that stung, things meant to make me feel small, to make me question my decision. But I stood my ground. I had spent too long bending to their will, and I wasn't going to do it anymore. After I hung up the phone, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief, because I had finally set a boundary. Sadness, because this was the final nail in the coffin of a relationship that had been fractured for so long. I knew that my decision would likely mean the end of whatever tenuous connection I had with my parents. And that hurt, no matter how much I tried to prepare for it. But in that moment, I also felt something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. Freedom from the guilt, the obligation, the endless cycle of trying to earn their approval. For the first time, I had put myself first. And even though it was painful, it felt like the beginning of something new. Because I deserved to be happy. And I deserved to be free from the weight of a relationship that had only ever held me down. After the phone call with my parents, where I finally set the boundary that I couldn't help them, I was left with a strange mix of emotions. I felt relief, as though a heavy weight had been lifted off my shoulders. But there was also a lingering sadness that I couldn't quite shake. It wasn't the kind of sadness that came from regret. It was the kind that came from confronting the harsh truth that the relationship with my parents had been fractured for as long as I could remember, and it probably would never be repaired. The days following my decision were filled with reflection. And as I began to process everything, my mind kept drifting back to my childhood. I knew I needed to understand the full scope of what had led me to this moment. It wasn't just their refusal to attend my wedding, or the years of subtle disapproval, or even the favoritism they'd shown toward my brother. It was the accumulation of so many small wounds that had festered over the years, building up into a deep and unshakable sense of resentment. I needed to revisit those old wounds if I was going to move forward. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my parents had never truly seen me, not the real me. At least, from the time I was little, I felt like I was always walking in Matthew's shadow. My brother, 3 years older, was the golden child. He was outgoing, athletic, and excelled at school in all the ways that my parents valued. I, on the other hand, was quieter, more introspective. I loved art, writing, and reading. All things my parents didn't really understand or care much about. From the beginning, it was clear that Matthew was the child who had inherited all of the qualities my parents admired. He was popular and confident, always surrounded by friends, and his achievements were met with open pride. He played on the soccer team, aced his math classes, and even won a couple of science fairs. My parents attended every single one of his soccer games, cheering him on from the sidelines, beaming with pride as he racked up goals and trophies. Meanwhile, I often found myself sitting alone at the kitchen table, working on sketches or writing stories in my notebook, with little acknowledgement from them. I still remember the feeling of sitting there, hoping that one day they'd notice what I was doing, that they'd ask to see my drawings or read one of my stories. But they never did. In their eyes, my accomplishments were small, insignificant, and the more I tried to get their attention, the more I felt invisible. One memory, in particular, stands out. It was my 8th grade art show. I had spent weeks working on a painting that I was especially proud of. And it had been selected to be displayed at the school's end-of-year exhibition. It wasn't just any painting, it was a self-portrait. Something deeply personal that I had poured my heart into. I had told my parents about the exhibition, practically begging them to come. They had smiled and said they'd try. But deep down, I knew what that meant. It meant they wouldn't show. The night of the exhibition came, and as expected, they weren't there. I stood next to my painting, watching as other kids' parents snapped pictures and showered their children with praise. I tried to convince myself that it didn't matter, that I didn't need their approval to feel proud of my work. But as the evening wore on, the absence of my parents felt heavier and heavier. By the time I got home, I was fighting back tears, trying to swallow the disappointment that had become all too familiar. When I walked through the door that night, my parents were sitting in the living room, watching TV. They didn't ask how the exhibition had gone, didn't ask if I had won any recognition. Instead, my dad casually asked if I had finished my homework, and my mom reminded me that Matthew had a soccer game the next morning that they'd need to leave early for. That was it, my achievement, my hard work. It wasn't even a blip on their radar. That was when I realized that nothing I did would ever measure up in their eyes. No matter how much effort I put into my art, or my studies, or any of the things I cared about, I would never be Matthew. I would never be the child they had envisioned, the one who made them proud. It was a painful realization, but it also freed me in a way. I stopped trying so hard to win their approval, knowing that it was something I would never truly have. I began to focus more on myself, on finding validation from within, and from the friends and mentors who saw me for who I really was. But the wounds were still there. Even after I left for college, I carried them with me. I chose a school far away from home, Partly because I wanted the freedom to live my life without their constant comparisons to Matthew. And partly because I knew that distance was the only way I could protect myself from the disappointment that seemed to follow every interaction with them. College was a chance to start fresh. To be around people who appreciated me for my individuality, not how I stacked up against my brother. The funny thing was, even with all that distance, my parents still managed to make me feel small. Every phone call, every holiday visit, was filled with subtle reminders that I was the child who had taken a different path. They would ask about my job, about my friends, but there was always a tone of disinterest, as if they were just going through the motions of polite conversation. And inevitably, the conversation would shift to Matthew, how well he was doing at his job, how happy they were with his new house, how perfect his wife was. It was like clockwork. I would call home, and within minutes, the focus would shift away from me and back to Matthew. No matter what I accomplished in my own life, it was never enough to hold their attention. I remember once, during one of our rare phone calls, telling them about a promotion I had just received at work. I had been so excited to share the news, thinking that maybe, for once, they'd be proud of me. But after I told them, there was a brief pause. And then my mom responded, "Oh, that's nice. By the way, did you hear that Matthew and his wife are thinking about having kids soon? Isn't that exciting?" I don't even remember what I said in response. I just remember feeling that familiar wave of disappointment wash over me. It didn't matter what I did. I would always be second to Matthew. Over time, I learned to expect less and less from my parents. I stopped calling as often, stopped sharing the details of my life with them, knowing that it wouldn't make a difference. And in a way, that made things easier. I focused on building relationships with people who actually cared, my friends, my partner, my coworkers. These were the people who saw me for who I was, who celebrated my achievements and supported me through my struggles. And slowly, I began to realize that I didn't need my parents' approval to feel whole. But the wounds were still there, buried deep beneath the surface. And when my wedding came around, those old wounds were ripped open again. I had invited my parents to the wedding, knowing that it was a long shot. I had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that they might see this as an opportunity to finally show up for me, to put the past aside and be there for one of the most important moments of my life. But when they declined, citing financial reasons that I knew weren't true, it felt like the final confirmation that I had always been waiting for. I would never be a priority to them. Their absence at my wedding hurt more than I had expected it to. As much as I had tried to prepare myself, to tell myself that it didn't matter, standing at the altar without them there felt like a final rejection. It was a reminder that, no matter how much I had grown, no matter how much I had accomplished, I was still that invisible child, standing in the shadow of my brother. Now, with their request for help, all those old feelings were bubbling back to the surface. The anger, the resentment, the sense of being overlooked, they were all still there, simmering beneath the surface. And as much as I wanted to help them, as much as I felt the pull of obligation and guilt, I couldn't ignore the years of emotional neglect that had led us to this point. I kept thinking back to those moments from my childhood, my parents' absence at my art show, their indifference toward my achievements, their constant focus on Matthew. These weren't isolated incidents, they were part of a larger pattern, a pattern that had shaped my entire relationship with them. And now, after years of neglect, they were asking me to step in and take care of them. They wanted me to be the dutiful son, the one who swooped in to save the day when they were in need. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't keep giving to a relationship that had never given anything back. It wasn't just about the money, or the help they were asking for. It was about protecting myself from the cycle of disappointment and hurt that I had been stuck in for years. It was about finally acknowledging that I had a right to set boundaries. That I didn't have to keep sacrificing my own happiness for the sake of people who had never truly been there for me. I knew that my decision would come with consequences. My parents would be furious. My extended family would likely judge me. And there would be whispers about how I had abandoned my parents in their time of need. But I also knew that I couldn't keep living my life for them. I had spent too long trying to win their love and approval. And now, for the first time, I was choosing to prioritize myself. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was a necessary one. Because in the end, I had learned that love, real love, isn't something you have to fight for. It's something that's given freely. Something that makes you feel seen and valued. And after years of feeling invisible, I was finally choosing to see myself. And that, more than anything else, was the closure I needed. After I made the decision not to help my parents, something in me shifted. It was subtle at first. Almost like a deep breath I hadn't realized I was holding finally being let out. For the first time, I had taken control of my relationship with my parents instead of letting them dictate the terms. I had set a boundary. One that was long overdue. And it felt both terrifying and freeing. The immediate aftermath wasn't easy. Though, my parents didn't take the news well when I told them I wouldn't be stepping in to help with their financial situation. I had tried to deliver the message as kindly and calmly as possible, explaining that I understood their difficulties but that I couldn't take on the responsibility they were asking of me. I mentioned the years of distance between us, the hurt from their absence at my wedding, and the emotional strain our relationship had caused me. But none of that mattered to them. All they heard was, no. My mother's reaction was swift and cutting. She accused me of being ungrateful, selfish, and heartless. After everything we've done for you, she said, her voice sharp with anger. This is how you repay us? By turning your back on your own parents when we need you the most? I felt the familiar pang of guilt flare up in my chest. My mother had always had a way of making me feel small, of turning the tables so that I was the one in the wrong, no matter the situation. But this time, I didn't back down. I stood firm, even though every instinct in me wanted to cave, to apologize, to take back what I had said and offer to help. Instead, I calmly reiterated my decision. I'm sorry you feel that way, I said, my voice steady despite the tremor I felt inside. But this is what I need to do for my own well-being. My father's reaction was less vocal, but no less painful. He didn't say much during the call. He rarely did in moments like this, but his silence spoke volumes. It was a cold, heavy silence, one that conveyed his disappointment more clearly than words ever could. He didn't need to yell or accuse me of anything. The mere fact that he wasn't defending me, wasn't trying to understand my side, was enough to make me feel the weight of his disapproval. When I hung up the phone, my hands were shaking. I felt a rush of emotions, anger, sadness, guilt, all swirling together in a chaotic mix that left me feeling unsettled. Part of me wondered if I had made the right choice. Had I gone too far? Was I being selfish, as my mother claimed? Should I have tried harder to reconcile, to help them despite everything? But the other part of me, the part that had been hurt by them for so many years, knew that this was the only way forward. I couldn't keep sacrificing my own happiness and mental health to meet their expectations. I had spent my whole life bending to their will, trying to earn their approval. And where had that gotten me? Nowhere. No matter how much I had tried, it had never been enough. They would always find something to criticize, something to hold against me, and I couldn't keep playing that game. I realized, in that moment, that setting boundaries wasn't just about saying no to them, it was about saying yes to myself. It was about reclaiming the parts of me that I had given away over the years in an attempt to make them happy. And as much as it hurt to see their disappointment, to hear their anger, I knew that I had done the right thing. Over the next few days, the fallout from my decision became more apparent. My mother called several more times, leaving long, emotional voicemails about how I was abandoning them, how I was letting down the family. She made it clear that my brother, Matthew, had always been the good son, the one they could count on, and that they had expected better from me. Her words were designed to sting, to make me question myself. And for a while, they did. I would listen to the voicemails late at night, my chest tightening as the guilt crept back in, wondering if I had made a mistake. But each time, I reminded myself why I had made the choice I did. I reminded myself of the years of neglect, of the way they had never shown up for me. Not even at my wedding. I reminded myself that this wasn't just about money, it was about respect. About emotional boundaries that I had let them cross for far too long. My extended family didn't help matters either. Word spread quickly that I had refused to help my parents. And before I knew it, I was receiving phone calls and messages from aunts, uncles, and cousins, all weighing in with their opinions. Some were understanding, offering words of support, telling me that I had the right to make my own decisions. But others were more critical, echoing my mother's accusations of selfishness. You know they're getting older, one of my aunts said during a particularly difficult phone call. They're not going to be around forever. Are you really okay with letting things end like this? Family is family, no matter what. I understood what she was saying, of course. I had thought about it, too. What if something happened to my parents? And our relationship was still in this fractured state? Would I regret not helping them? Would I regret not trying harder to mend things before it was too late? These were the questions that haunted me, even as I tried to stand firm in my decision. But as the days turned into weeks, I started to feel a growing sense of clarity. It wasn't that the guilt or doubt disappeared entirely, those feelings still lingered, creeping in during quiet moments when I was alone with my thoughts. But they no longer held the same power over me. Instead, I began to recognize that setting boundaries with my parents was an act of self-preservation. Not selfishness. It was about protecting myself from the emotional toll that our relationship had taken on me for so many years. I started to reflect on the concept of family, what it meant, and how it had shaped my understanding of love and loyalty. Growing up, I had been taught that family was everything, that no matter what, you stood by your family in their time of need. But what I had come to realize was that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who show up for you, who support you, who see you for who you truly are and love you unconditionally. In that sense, my parents had never really been my family. Yes, they were my biological parents, and there would always be a connection between us because of that. But they had never truly shown up for me in the ways that mattered. They had never been there when I needed them, never celebrated my successes, never made me feel like I was enough. And now, they were asking me to sacrifice my own well-being to support them, without any acknowledgement of the years of emotional neglect they had inflicted on me. It wasn't fair, and for the first time in my life, I was allowing myself to admit that. Around this time, I started therapy, something I had considered for years but had always put off. The decision to seek help felt like another step in reclaiming my sense of self. In taking control of my own narrative, I wanted to understand how my relationship with my parents had shaped me, how it had impacted the way I viewed myself and my worth. I wanted to unpack the years of resentment and hurt that I had buried deep inside. And I wanted to learn how to heal from it. Therapy wasn't an immediate fix, of course. It wasn't like I walked into the first session and magically felt better. But it was a start. My therapist helped me explore the patterns in my family dynamic, the ways in which I had internalized my parents' treatment of me and how it had influenced my relationships. Not just with them, but with others. We talked about the guilt I felt for setting boundaries, about the societal and familial pressures that made me feel like I was in the wrong for prioritizing my own well-being. One of the things my therapist said that stuck with me was this: setting boundaries doesn't mean you're cutting people out of your life. It means you're creating a space where you can exist without being harmed. That idea, creating a space where I could exist without being harmed, became my guiding principle. I had spent so much of my life feeling like I had to accommodate my parents, like I had to shrink myself to fit into the role they wanted me to play. But now, I was learning that I didn't have to do that anymore. I could create boundaries that allowed me to protect myself, to exist fully as the person I had become, without being constantly hurt by their rejection or criticism. As I continued with therapy, I also began to rebuild my sense of self outside of my family. I leaned into my relationship with my partner, who had been my biggest support system throughout all of this. I reconnected with friends who had become like family to me over the years. People who had shown me what unconditional love and support looked like. These were the relationships that mattered, the ones that gave me strength and reminded me that I was worthy of love and respect. In setting boundaries with my parents, I had feared that I would be left feeling isolated, cut off from my family. But what I found instead was that by creating space for myself, I had opened up room for healthier, more fulfilling relationships. I no longer felt the need to constantly prove myself to people who would never be satisfied. Instead, I was learning to find validation from within, from the people who truly cared about me, and from the life I had built for myself. There were still moments of sadness, of course. I wasn't naive enough to believe that setting boundaries would magically erase the hurt of my childhood, or that I wouldn't still long for the kind of parental love and support that I had never received. But I was learning to make peace with that sadness, to accept it as part of my journey, without letting it define me. Because ultimately, setting boundaries wasn't just about protecting myself from further harm, it was about reclaiming my own sense of worth. It was about recognizing that I deserved to be treated with respect. That I didn't have to keep sacrificing my own happiness for people who had never truly seen me. And in doing so, I was finally beginning to heal. The turning point had come not when I said no to my parents, but when I said yes to myself. And that, more than anything, was the moment I began to feel free. In the weeks after I told my parents I wouldn't be helping them, the fallout started to unfold. Slowly but steadily. I had expected their anger. And I had expected my extended family to have opinions they wouldn't hesitate to share. What I hadn't fully anticipated was the depth of the backlash, the way it would ripple through my life, and the emotional toll it would take on me. My mother, as I had come to expect, didn't let the matter drop. Her initial phone calls of outrage had turned into a constant stream of guilt-laden messages and emails. She laid it on thick, reminding me of everything they had done for me when I was a child. All the sacrifices they had made to provide for me and my brother. She would say things like, "We gave you everything we could, and this is how you repay us," and, "Your father worked so hard to make sure you had opportunities, more than he ever had, and now you're just abandoning us in our time of need." The weight of her words was hard to shake. Guilt had always been my mother's weapon of choice, and she wielded it with precision. Every message was carefully crafted to make me feel like the worst kind of person, selfish, ungrateful, heartless. She painted a picture of themselves as loving, sacrificing parents, and me as the cold, unfeeling child who had turned my back on them. And even though I knew, deep down, that I had made the right choice for myself, her words still had the power to sting. It was my father's silence, though, that hurt the most. He had always been the quieter of the two, less prone to emotional outbursts. But in this case, his silence felt like a judgment. He didn't call, he didn't text, he didn't even attempt to argue with me the way my mother did. He simply withdrew, and in that withdrawal, I felt his disapproval more acutely than if he had shouted at me. It was as though he had written me off, like I had become just another disappointment in a long line of failures in his eyes. The extended family, of course, had plenty to say. My aunts, uncles, and cousins reached out, one by one, each with their own version of the same message: they're still your parents. Some tried to be more tactful, gently suggesting that maybe I could find a way to help without fully taking on the responsibility, while others were more direct, accusing me of being selfish and ungrateful. There were the inevitable comparisons to Matthew, my brother, who had always been the more dutiful son in their eyes. Matthew would never abandon them like this, one of my aunts had said during a particularly difficult conversation. He's always done whatever he could to support them. I just don't understand why you can't do the same. That comment stung more than I cared to admit. The comparisons to Matthew had been a constant refrain throughout my life. And even though I had long ago accepted that I would never be seen in the same light as him, hearing it again in this context hurt. It was like being told, once again, that I wasn't enough, that I had failed to live up to the standard that had been set for me. No matter what I did, I was always falling short. I tried to explain my decision to those who would listen, but it was hard to articulate everything I had been feeling, the years of emotional neglect, the favoritism, the way my parents had never truly been there for me. When I told them about my parents' absence at my wedding, some seemed to understand a little better, but others brushed it off, saying things like, "Well, they must have had their reasons," or, "That doesn't change the fact that they need you now." The message was clear. My feelings didn't matter. My history with my parents didn't matter. What mattered was that they were in need. And as their son, I had an obligation to help. It was as though all the hurt I had experienced over the years was irrelevant in the face of their current situation. My pain was dismissed as secondary, unimportant. It was exhausting. Every conversation, every message, felt like a battle. I found myself replaying old memories in my mind, trying to make sense of everything. I thought about the birthday parties where Matthew had been the star of the show, while I was barely acknowledged. I thought about the school events they had missed, the art shows they hadn't bothered to attend, the way they had never seemed interested in my life unless it fit into the mold they had created for me. I thought about my wedding day, the one day where I had hoped, even expected, that they might finally show up for me. And they hadn't. That memory alone was enough to remind me why I had made the decision I had. But still, the guilt lingered. It was hard to shake the feeling that I was letting everyone down, that I was somehow failing as a son, even though I knew, logically, that I had the right to set boundaries. Emotionally, it felt like I was breaking some unspoken rule of family loyalty. It didn't help that my extended family seemed determined to reinforce that idea, reminding me at every turn that family comes first. My wife was my only true source of support during this time. She stood by me unwaveringly, reminding me that I wasn't doing anything wrong. She listened to my frustrations, validated my feelings, and helped me navigate the barrage of criticism coming from all sides. But even with her support, I couldn't help but feel isolated. It was like I was living in two different worlds, one where I was standing up for myself, setting healthy boundaries, and another where I was constantly being told that I was a bad person for doing so. Therapy became my lifeline. I had already started working with my therapist on setting boundaries. But now, our sessions took on a new urgency. We talked a lot about guilt, where it came from, how deeply ingrained it was in me, and how to manage it without letting it dictate my actions. My therapist helped me see that guilt wasn't always an indicator that I had done something wrong. Sometimes, it was simply a sign that I was breaking free from unhealthy patterns, and that the discomfort I was feeling was part of the process of growth. It wasn't easy, but I started to reframe the way I thought about my decision. Instead of seeing it as a failure to help my parents, I began to see it as an act of self-care. I wasn't abandoning them, I was choosing not to sacrifice myself for people who had never shown me the same consideration. I was setting boundaries because I deserved to protect my own emotional well-being. And that didn't make me selfish. It made me human. There were still moments, though, when the weight of everything felt overwhelming. Late at night, when the house was quiet and I was alone with my thoughts, the guilt would creep back in, whispering that maybe I had made the wrong choice, that maybe I should have done more. I would think about my father, sitting in silence, and wonder if I had truly become a disappointment to him. I would think about my mother's angry words, the way she had accused me of abandoning them, and wonder if she was right. But then I would remind myself of all the times they had abandoned me. Not physically, maybe, but emotionally. They had never been there for me in the ways that mattered. They had never celebrated my successes, never comforted me in my failures. They had never shown up for me. And now, they were expecting me to show up for them without question. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't my responsibility to fix the dynamic they had created. Slowly, I began to feel more at peace with my decision. The calls from my extended family eventually tapered off, and even my mother stopped her constant barrage of messages. My father remained silent, and in that silence, I found a strange kind of closure. He had made his choice, and I had made mine. We were at an impasse, and perhaps that was the way it was always meant to be. As the weeks passed, I started to focus more on the relationships that truly mattered. My wife, my friends, the people who had been there for me throughout this whole ordeal. These were the people who deserved my energy, my love, my attention. I began to pour more of myself into those relationships, nurturing them, appreciating the ways they made me feel seen and valued. And in doing so, I realized that I didn't need my parents' approval, or my extended family's validation. To feel whole, I had built a life for myself, one that was full of love, support, and joy. And while the fallout from my decision had been difficult, it had also been necessary. It had forced me to confront the lingering wounds from my past, to face the guilt and shame that had been holding me back, and to finally, once and for all, let go of the need for my parents' approval. In the end, the fallout wasn't just about losing a relationship with my parents. It was about gaining something much more valuable, a sense of self-worth, independent of their expectations. It was about learning to prioritize my own happiness and well-being, and realizing that I didn't have to keep sacrificing myself for people who had never truly been there for me. The fallout had been painful, yes, but it had also been liberating. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. After the dust settled and the emotional chaos of my parents' rejection subsided, I found myself standing on unfamiliar ground. For the first time in my life, I had made a decision solely for my own well-being, without worrying about how it would make my parents or extended family feel. The fallout from my refusal to help my parents had been intense, and the weight of their disappointment and the guilt of my extended family's judgment still lingered. But as those voices slowly quieted, I started to hear something new, a voice I hadn't heard in years, my own. It wasn't that I suddenly felt invincible, like all the hurt had been magically wiped away. That's not how healing works. There were still moments when doubt would creep in. Moments when I'd wonder if I had made the right choice. Or if I had somehow failed them by standing up for myself. But there was also something else growing inside me. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of self-worth. For years, I had defined myself through the lens of my parents' approval. Or lack thereof. Every decision I made, every success I achieved, was weighed against their expectations. Their judgments. Even when I tried to break free from that. To live my life on my own terms. I couldn't fully escape the shadow of their disappointment. It was always there, looming in the background, reminding me that no matter how far I went, no matter what I did, I would never truly measure up in their eyes. But now, with that chapter of my life behind me, I began to see things more clearly. I had spent so much of my life seeking validation from people who would never give it to me. And in doing so, I had lost sight of my own worth. I had allowed their indifference, their neglect, to shape the way I saw myself, to convince me that I wasn't enough, that I wasn't deserving of love and respect simply for being who I was. But that wasn't true. I had always been enough. And it was time for me to start believing that. The process of rediscovering my self-worth wasn't an overnight transformation. It was gradual, like peeling back layers of doubt and insecurity that had built up over the years. One of the first things I did was to start acknowledging my own accomplishments, not in a way that sought external validation, but in a way that allowed me to recognize my own value. I had built a life for myself that I was proud of. A life that I had worked hard for. And it was time for me to celebrate that. I thought back to all the moments that had shaped me. The achievements that had gone unnoticed by my parents but had meant the world to me. Graduating college, landing my first job, getting promotions, creating meaningful relationships with people who cared about me. These were things I had done on my own. I had worked for them, fought for them, and I had succeeded, despite the lack of support from my parents. That was something to be proud of. And I started to give myself permission to feel that pride. I also started to reflect on the relationships in my life that had nourished me. The people who had been there for me when my parents hadn't. My wife, of course, had been my rock through all of this, offering me unconditional love and support at every turn. She had always seen my worth, even when I couldn't see it in myself. And then there were my friends. The chosen family I had built over the years. These were the people who had celebrated my successes, comforted me in my failures, and stood by me through thick and thin. These relationships were a testament to my worth, a reminder that I didn't need my parents' approval to be loved and valued. The people who truly mattered in my life had always seen me for who I was. And they had embraced me fully. I had spent so long focusing on the people who didn't show up for me, that I had almost forgotten to appreciate the ones who did. As I began to shift my focus away from my parents' disappointment and toward the love and support I had in my life, something remarkable happened. I started to feel lighter. The guilt that had weighed me down for so long began to lift, replaced by a sense of peace. I didn't have to carry the burden of their expectations anymore. I didn't have to constantly prove myself to people who would never be satisfied. I could finally let that go. Part of this process also involved letting go of the comparisons to my brother, Matthew. For years, I had measured myself against him, always feeling like I came up short in my parents' eyes. Matthew had been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, the one who had always been praised and celebrated, while I had been the afterthought. But now, as I looked at my life, I realized that those comparisons didn't matter anymore. I wasn't in competition with Matthew. My life was my own, and I was living it the best way I knew how. It wasn't that I resented Matthew for being the favored child. He hadn't asked for that role any more than I had asked to be the outsider. In many ways, he had his own struggles with the weight of our parents' expectations. Though those struggles had manifested differently than mine, what I came to realize was that comparing myself to him had only held me back, kept me stuck in a cycle of self-doubt that I no longer needed to participate in. My path was different from his, and that was okay. I didn't need to live up to anyone else's standard of success. I just needed to live a life that made me happy, a life that felt authentic to who I was. As part of this rediscovery process, I also began to invest more time and energy into the things that brought me joy, the passions and interests that had always been a part of me but had often taken a backseat to the demands of trying to please others. I started painting again, something I hadn't done in years. Art had always been a refuge for me, A way to express myself when words weren't enough. But somewhere along the way, I had lost touch with that part of myself. Now, with the weight of my parents' expectations lifted, I felt free to explore my creativity again. It wasn't just painting, though. I also started writing more, journaling, reflecting, and even dabbling in some short stories. Writing had always been another outlet for me, a way to process my emotions and make sense of the world around me. As I poured my thoughts and feelings onto the page, I found that it was a form of therapy in itself. It helped me untangle the complicated emotions I had been carrying for so long. And in doing so, it brought me closer to understanding who I was and what I wanted out of life. I also made a conscious effort to take care of my mental and physical health. The stress of my relationship with my parents had taken a toll on me over the years. And I knew that in order to truly heal, I needed to prioritize my well-being. I started exercising more regularly, not just as a way to stay in shape, but as a way to clear my mind and release the tension that had built up inside me. I focused on mindfulness practices, taking time each day to slow down, breathe, and reflect on what I was grateful for. The more I invested in myself, my passions, my relationships, my health, the more I realized that I was capable of living a fulfilling life on my own terms. I didn't need my parents' approval to feel worthy. I didn't need to be the perfect son or meet their impossible standards. I was enough, just as I was. There were still moments when doubt crept in, of course. Healing is rarely a straight path. And there were days when I found myself slipping back into old patterns of self-doubt. But each time that happened, I reminded myself of how far I had come, of the strength it had taken to set boundaries with my parents and choose my own happiness. I reminded myself that I was allowed to prioritize my own well-being, that I didn't have to carry the weight of their disappointment anymore. As I continued to rediscover my self-worth, I also began to feel a deeper sense of peace. It wasn't just about letting go of the past. It was about embracing the present and looking forward to the future with a sense of hope and possibility. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my own life, free to make decisions that aligned with my values and my sense of self. The relationships that mattered most to me were thriving, and I was learning to love and accept myself in ways I never had before. I wasn't perfect, but I didn't need to be. I was enough, just as I was. And that realization was more liberating than I could have ever imagined. As I stood on this new foundation of self-worth, I knew that the journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt, and more opportunities to grow. But for the first time, I felt ready to face whatever came next, armed with the knowledge that I was capable of creating a life that was full, meaningful, and entirely my own. Because in the end, I had learned one of the most important lessons of all. My worth wasn't something to be earned. It had been within me all along. I just needed to see it for myself. As the weeks turned into months, I began to settle into a new rhythm of life, one where my parents' opinions no longer dictated my actions, where their absence became less a source of pain and more of a quiet acceptance. I had come to terms with my decision not to help them financially, and the emotional fallout that followed had begun to fade. Yet, in the back of my mind, there was still a lingering sense that something hadn't fully resolved, that there was still one more confrontation waiting to happen. It came in the form of an unexpected letter. One morning, as I was going through my usual routine, making coffee, reading the news, and preparing for the day, I noticed an envelope sitting on the kitchen counter. My wife had brought in the mail the night before, and I hadn't bothered to go through it. But now, the envelope caught my attention. It was addressed to me, and the handwriting was unmistakably my mother's. I hadn't heard from her or my father in months. After my final refusal to help, the calls and messages had stopped, and I had assumed that they had moved on, perhaps turning to Matthew for the support they needed. But here was this letter, sitting quietly on my kitchen counter, a tangible reminder that they still hadn't let go. For a moment, I considered throwing it away without even opening it. After all, what more was there to say? We had reached an impasse months ago, and nothing had changed since then. But curiosity, and, perhaps, a small part of me that still longed for some kind of resolution, got the better of me. I opened the envelope and began to read. The letter started off in the way most of my mother's communications did, polite, formal, and heavy with unspoken tension. She wrote about their financial situation, how things had gotten worse since we last spoke. My father's job prospects hadn't improved, and they were now facing the very real possibility of losing their home. She mentioned my brother, Matthew, and how he had been doing his best to help, but his own financial struggles meant he couldn't provide much support either. The tone of the letter was calm, almost resigned, but I could sense the desperation underneath. And then, as I read further, the tone shifted. My mother began to accuse me of abandoning them in their time of need, of betraying the family that had raised me. She listed every perceived sacrifice they had made for me over the years: the clothes on my back, the food on the table, the education they had provided. She framed it all as if they had given me everything, as if I owed them my life in return. The familiar guilt-laden tactics were there. But this time, there was something different. This time, she went further than she ever had before. "We've always known that you were different," she wrote. "Matthew was the one who understood family, who knew the value of loyalty. You, on the other hand, have always been selfish. We did everything we could to raise you right, but you turned your back on us the moment you could. And now, when we need you most, you've proven just how ungrateful you really are. We may have made mistakes, but you're the one who's truly failed this family." I stopped reading. My hands shook as I held the letter, a knot forming in my chest. This wasn't just another attempt to guilt me into helping them. This was a direct attack on who I was, on my character, on everything I had worked so hard to overcome. It was one thing to criticize my decision, to express disappointment in my refusal to help. But this was different. This was an assault on my worth as a person. A declaration that no matter what I did, no matter how far I had come, I would always be the failure in their eyes. I sat down at the kitchen table, the letter still in my hands, and tried to process what I was feeling. Anger. Of course, anger that they could be so cruel, so blind to their own faults. But there was also a deep sadness, the kind that comes from realizing that there would never be a resolution, never be a way to bridge the gap between us. I had held on to the hope that maybe, someday, they would understand my side, that they would see the years of hurt and neglect that had led to this moment. But this letter was the final confirmation that they never would. They had made up their minds about me a long time ago. I was the problem. I was the selfish one, the ungrateful one, the one who had failed the family. And nothing I did, no amount of explaining, no attempt to set boundaries would ever change that. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. I felt numb, like my body was moving through the motions without my mind fully engaged. My wife came into the kitchen a few moments later, noticing the look on my face, and asked if everything was okay. I handed her the letter without a word, letting her read for herself what my mother had written. When she finished, she looked at me, her eyes full of concern and quiet understanding. "I'm sorry," she said softly, reaching for my hand. "You didn't deserve that." I nodded, but I couldn't bring myself to speak just yet. The words were still swirling in my mind, my mother's accusations echoing in my ears. "You've always been selfish. You've failed this family." That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the letter. I replayed every line in my head, analyzing the words, trying to make sense of how things had gotten to this point. My mother had always been manipulative, always quick to guilt-trip me into doing what she wanted. But this felt like a new low. It was as if she had given up on trying to persuade me and had decided instead to attack me personally. To strip me down to my core and tell me, once and for all, that I was worthless. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. How dare she say those things? How dare she try to make me feel like I was the one who had failed? After everything they had put me through, the years of neglect, the favoritism toward Matthew, the way they had ignored my needs, my successes, how could she possibly think that I owed them anything? How could she blame me for protecting myself, for setting boundaries that should have been there all along? But underneath the anger, there was also a deep, aching sadness. The kind of sadness that comes from realizing that the relationship I had with my parents was truly broken beyond repair. I had spent years trying to fix it, trying to find some way to connect with them, to make them understand me. But now, with this letter, it was clear that there was no going back. They had made up their minds about who I was, and nothing I did or said would ever change that. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of clarity. The anger and sadness were still there. But so was something else, a quiet resolve. This letter, as painful as it was, had shown me something important. I had been right to set boundaries. I had been right to protect myself. My parents' view of me, their constant need to tear me down, was their problem, not mine. I didn't have to carry their judgments any longer. I sat down at my desk, pulled out a piece of paper, and began to write my own letter in response. I didn't know if I would ever send it, but I needed to get the words out. I needed to reclaim my narrative, to speak the truth that my parents had refused to see for so long. I wrote about the years of neglect, the way they had favored Matthew and ignored my accomplishments. I wrote about the pain of standing in the shadows, always trying to be enough, always coming up short. I wrote about my wedding, how their absence had felt like a final rejection, and how their refusal to support me had made it clear that I was never truly part of the family in the way they wanted me to be. But most of all, I wrote about the importance of boundaries. I explained that my decision not to help them wasn't born out of selfishness or cruelty, but out of a need to protect myself from further harm. I had spent my entire life giving to a relationship that had only taken from me, and I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't keep sacrificing my own happiness and well-being for people who refused to see me, who refused to love me for who I was. When I finished the letter, I sat back and read it over. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't meant to be. It was raw, honest, and full of emotions that had been bottled up for years. But it felt good to get it all out, to put my truth down on paper, even if no one else ever read it. As I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, I felt a strange sense of peace. This was the final straw, the moment when I finally let go of the hope that my parents would ever change. I had done everything I could to repair the relationship, but it wasn't enough, and it never would be. And that was okay. It wasn't my job to fix them. It wasn't my job to carry the weight of their disappointment. I wasn't selfish. I wasn't ungrateful. I had simply chosen to prioritize my own well-being, to set boundaries that should have been in place all along. And in doing so, I had freed myself from the cycle of guilt and obligation that had held me captive for so long. The final straw wasn't the letter itself. The final straw was realizing that I didn't need their approval to live my life. I didn't need their validation to know my own worth. I was enough, just as I was. And with that realization, I felt lighter than I had in years. From that moment on, I began to live my life on my own terms, free from the expectations of people who had never truly seen me. It wasn't always easy, and there were still moments when the old guilt would creep back in. But I had made peace with the fact that my relationship with my parents was broken, and that I had done everything I could to repair it. I wasn't the failure they had painted me to be. I was simply me, whole, imperfect, and finally free.